Welcome back to the Ignatius Press podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Petiprin, joined today by a repeat visitor, someone we've had on the podcast already, and someone who will no doubt be known to a lot of our listeners and viewers. If you're not familiar with him, I am very, very happy to introduce you to him today. Our guest is Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, whose voice will be familiar to listeners of EWTN Radio. He is the host of Beacon of Truth. He's the author of several books, and he's a very frequent visitor to parish, dioceses, conferences, events, all sorts of things. No doubt you will have seen Deacon Harold somewhere out there. Deacon Harold, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's a joy to get a chance to talk to you, and sort of the excuse for having a second conversation with you today, at least the first excuse that we're going to put on the table, is we're recording this as our country celebrates Martin Luther King Day, which is a federal holiday. It's been in existence for about as long as I can remember. I think it started in the 1980s. And, you know, I think it's fair to say it's something most people are very happy about, very happy to have. It's very important that we have that special celebration. So before we get into that, I wonder, you know, for you now as a Catholic man, but you haven't always been a Catholic.
I actually have always been a Catholic.
Sorry. Say more, Deacon Harold, before we launch in.
Yeah, so I'm the first baptized Catholic in the history of my family.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I'm from Barbados in the West Indies. My mother was a Methodist who became a Catholic as a teenager, and when she got married to my dad, so my mom didn't have to be baptized because we recognized the baptism of Methodists. You just had confirmation, first communion. So I'm the oldest child. So when I was born, I was baptized. So I'm the first a baptized Catholic in the history of our family.
Oh, well, thanks be to God for that. You know, I think it's on my part in these conversations, I have a little bit of a kind of convert bias because I myself am a convert to the Catholic faith, having been a Protestant before. But anyway, let's talk about Martin Luther King. And, you know, for you growing up in the United States, what are your kind of early memories of Martin Luther King and celebrating his legacy?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I mean, the honest truth is I didn't think much about Martin Luther King. I mean, when we were growing up in school, I mean, we learned about him in history class and things like that, and the impact that he did and that he had on the civil rights movement and for the rights of people of color all throughout the United States, but not really delving into him as far as reading the stuff that he wrote. I mean, we'd see like little documentaries and things like that about Dr. King, but really didn't really have much engagement with his thought, really, and really as a kid, not really understanding the impact of his work and his legacy until actually much later, as an adult. And again, looking at things with perspective, looking back at certain aspects of my life and experiences, you know, being in an interracial marriage, you know, my wife is German and Irish, and all those things coming together, and then actually starting to read what he wrote, particularly when I was writing the book on the Catholic response to racism, building a civilization of love, reading the letter from a Birmingham jail, reading his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, reading the speech that he made on the lawn of Washington Lincoln Memorial. I mean, and then now reading it, going, "Whoa, wait a minute! He totally got it." You know, one of the things that he wrote in his Nobel Peace Prize speech that I quote in the book, he says, "Sooner or later, all of the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace, and thereby transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood." Right? So he had a very optimistic outlook on the issues of race happening within the United States. I mean, he spoke those words 60 years ago when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. And he went on to say that if peace and racial justice is to be achieved, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method, Dr. King says, is love. And I read that. I'm like, yes, exactly. Because look what's happening, especially during the pandemic with the George Floyd and the other incidents. How did we respond to that? How did a lot of people respond to that? Revenge, aggression, and retaliation. Exactly the opposite of what Dr. King said how we should respond to these things. And he said that the foundation is rooted in love, which immediately took me to 1 John 4:16. God is love, and he who lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. So Martin Luther King Jr. totally got it. He understood that if we're really to make a huge difference, it's not about changing systems, it's about changing people, right? Jesus Christ did not come to save systems, he came to save people, and that's where we need to start.
Yeah, and it seems to me, Deacon Harold, that was precisely, even at the time, what resonated with people who might not otherwise have been particularly sympathetic even to the civil rights movement. To hear a man speak from the perspective of being a Christian pastor, preaching nonviolence, and really focusing on these things, which, if we're a Christian country, which to some degree we always have been and are, then these are issues that we must confront. And so it seems like, coming from Martin Luther King, they were somehow miraculously, by God's grace, not completely, but largely received, to the point where today, I think you'd be very hard to find anyone, if you just stopped someone on the street and said, what do you think of Martin Luther King Jr.? I think it would be extremely unlikely that someone would say something negative.
Oh, there's some negative things floating on out there about Dr. King, particularly about his personal life and extramarital. I mean, that's look,
Sure.
like, for example, I love music. I'm a musician. I listen to tons of music. Music has been such a huge part of my life for most of my life. And when I talk about the artists that I enjoy listening to, for example, my favorite band of all time, I think that's had the biggest impact on my psyche and just the way is Queen. I mean, I've been listening to Queen since I was 10 years old. I heard Bohemian Rhapsody and I was just like, what is this? I mean, it was transformative for me. But of course, Freddie Mercury, was a very flamboyant. He was bisexual and all that kind of stuff. People say, how could you listen to Queen because of Freddie? I'm listening to the music. I could care less about their personal life. I'm not interested in their personal life. I'm interested in the music. Same thing with Dr. King. Look, we're all sinners in need of God's mercy. We're the people that Jesus came to save. We're not perfect in the way we live out in this world, and we're all going to make mistakes. Look at King David, greatest king in the history of Israel. Acts of the Apostle says he's a man after God's own heart. But remember Bathsheba? Like, come on. Look, we're all sinners. And so I don't focus on the personal life. I focus on what he did and the accomplishments and the purpose for which God placed him here. And that's what I focus on.
Yeah. And it seems like there are certain people in history who embody more than their own lives. And clearly Martin Luther King was one of those people. He was born at such a time and was equipped in just such a way that he was able to kind of rise to the occasion. And here we are celebrating him today.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things, again, if there were two documents that I would recommend people to read, the Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech and a letter from a Birmingham jail, because he outlines, even quotes St. Thomas Aquinas in the letter from Birmingham jail. I mean, this man was well read, he was well spoken, and he totally understood what needs to happen in order to make an effect change. And I think, quite frankly, that he would be disappointed when he saw the efforts that are happening today, because of the influence of things like critical race theory and liberation theology into this movement, like the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. It's about, it actually moves away from what Dr. King talked about, and moving into changing systems, and they have to use conflict, tension, and aggression in order to facilitate a change to the system. Because, for example, critical race theory's understanding of racism has nothing to do with biology or genetics or culture. For them, race is a tool used by a predominant race against another race, or what they call inferior race, or a lower race, whatever. So that's a whole different way of thinking and approaching the issue than what Martin Luther King did. So critical race theory, again, talks about changing system. We have to change structures. And we use tension, conflict, struggle in order to do that. Whereas Dr. King and my approach in building a civilization of love is about changing people. Because who makes up the system? People. Mm-hmm. People. And so you have to start with people first in order to facilitate change to the system. And the culture, I think, is exactly backwards. It's about changing systems, and eventually changing the system will change people. I think it's completely backwards.
If I'm hearing you correctly, Deacon Harold, and I want to be clear, because I think what you're saying is something that, other admirers of Dr. King might challenge. But I think I agree with you, if I'm hearing you correctly, that he really wouldn't be that interested in the critical race theory and things like the Black Lives Matter movement, maybe, or he would have a critique of them anyway.
Well, yeah, because remember those things. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher, right? So he has very strong biblical foundation as well as theology and philosophy, as a hermeneutic for which he articulated his position on how we overcome racial inequality and seek racial justice. But critical race theory in it, they have they don't take into account any kind of faith-based system at all. It's not even part of their DNA. It's not even a hint of any way in which they address these issues. And so they're starting from a whole different foundation, a whole different place on how to deal with these issues. And so, so I think he would be disappointed in the sense that they've lost the kind of the moorings. They've lost the bearings. It's like a compass losing its center, losing its direction. The further we've gotten away from God as a country, as a society, the further we're moving away from the ideals that Dr. Martin Luther King prescribed. Again, using faith as a foundation and a springboard upon which to employ his ideas for racial justice and equality. We've moved away from that now, and I think that's what he would be disappointed with.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I said before that Martin Luther King was an extraordinary man in his own right, and he also embodied hopes and expectations. He brought forward work that maybe he didn't even know others before him had done, but that had been, good gospel work for the sake of, having a society where every person is understood to be a dignified, beloved creature of God. And you have done some pioneering work in popularizing a figure that I want to talk about now a little bit, Father Augustus Tolton, who was the first American Black Roman Catholic priest. Fascinating figure that I really didn't know very much about until I read your book and a couple of other resources about it. Tell us a little bit about Father Tolton and how you discovered him.
Yeah, so I first came across Father Tolton by accident, like literally by accident. So I grew up in the Archdiocese of Newark in New Jersey, and confirmation at the time was during 7th grade. So sister was going through, all the names of confirmation saints that we could choose. And I was like, okay, those are all great, wonderful, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the apostles, all these great, wonderful saints. But I thought, I wonder if there's any saints that look like me, because there are no saints of color in that list of names that they gave us to pick from. And so I decided to go to the library, So for you younger viewers, a library is a building that has books in it. You don't do your research on the internet. You actually go someplace and get a book and read it. And so I went there and I went looking for books on, Black saints or African saints, saints of color. And I accidentally came across Sister Carolyn Hemesat's book, From Slave to Priest, which is the definitive biography of Father Augustus Tolton. And I said, what is this? And I pulled it off the shelf, and I remember paging through it. I remember thinking, well, I can't use this guy as a saint because he's not a saint. But I was paging through it, kind of read it. They're like, wow, this is interesting. And I put it back on the shelf and continued my search, search for a Black saint. And so, and by the way, just to put a little end to that, the coda on that story there is, I ended up choosing St. Philip from Acts of the Apostles because of his encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch. And of course, St. Philip was a deacon, and God, with a sense of humor, not knowing that, 30 years later, I become a deacon, right? So God had got a wonderful sense of humor there. And so that's why I first came across Father Tolton. I didn't really pick up interest in him again until Ignatius Press bought the rights to Sister Hemesat's book and reissued From Slave to Priest as under Ignatius Press. And they asked me to write the new foreword to the book and also to promote the book, which I was very, very happy to do. Since, again, I said I was reintroduced to Father Tolton and read really for the first time Sister Hemesat's book. And I was like, wow, he just became an incredible inspiration for me. And I was happy to do that work. And so then I thought, after reading his book and being inspired by his life, I thought, what kind of things can we learn from the life of Father Tolton? What kind of lessons can his life teach us today? And so that was the impetus for writing my book on Father Tolton. Again, it's not a biography. Sister Hemesat already has a biography on Father Tolton, and I used the first chapter as kind of summarizing his life for people who are not familiar with Father Tolton. But the rest of the book is talking about the impact of his life and his legacy in our church and in our world today.
Yeah, I want to get into that, maybe with just a one more note about his biography for people who've never heard about him. He was born into slavery, and I'll throw it back to you in just a second, but he went to Rome, and my understanding was he wanted to be a missionary, but where he was needed to be a missionary was right back where he came from, namely the United States, in the kind of very new post-slavery reality that where he was needed.
Yeah. So when his family escaped through the Underground Railroad, they escaped to Quincy, Illinois, and they had trouble finding a place to attend as a family. They're Catholics and want to attend church. So they finally found a church that would accept them. It was an Irish church. Father Peter McGurr was the pastor. Well, Father McGurr, over the years of the Tolton family attending the church there, saw something in the young Tolton and encouraged him to become a priest. The problem is, when he got old enough and Father McGurr helped him apply to seminaries throughout the United States, they all rejected him because he was Black. So the way he got in was through the Vatican seminary called the Propaganda Fidei, or the Propagation of the Faith. It's a seminary at the Vatican that's designed for men who come from countries who don't have seminaries. So at that time, Asian countries or on the continent of Africa, they did not have seminaries to send their men to become priests. And so when a bishop identified a young man or a group of young men to be considered for the priesthood, they sent them to the Vatican seminary. The Vatican trained them and then sent them back to their country to function as priests. So that's the way that Father Tolton got in. Now, after he was ordained, he thought, okay, well, they're going to send me to one of these countries that don't have a seminary so I could be a missionary priest. And he thought about Borneo. He thought maybe he would go to a country in the continent of Africa, Nigeria or Tanzania or something like that. So they did end up sending him to a missionary country, back to the United States. In fact, back to Quincy, Illinois, the same city where he endured so much racial injustice. When that announcement came from the cardinal giving him his assignment he was a little bit despondent, and he actually went to adoration and took it to prayer. He said he felt like he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. Take this cup from me, but not as I will, but as you will. So he finally accepted, this is where God wants me. This is where I'm going to be. He went back. In fact, he said his very first mass for a group of German nuns at a hospital in New Jersey, in a chapel. In fact, the plaque is still on the wall to this very day. Then he went to say mass in New York City, and worked his way back to Quincy, where he began his work as a pastor.
Wow. You write in your book, he was a beacon of hope to Black Catholics in the 19th century who were trying to find a home in the American church. Father Tolton, in his abiding faith and selfless charity, was the instrument through which God's love shone brightly. I think that's an interesting point that you make there that I'd love to hear more about. After the Civil War, obviously there were, the former slaves and Black people on North and South were Christians. But what did he mean in terms of like the future for Black Christians in America with regard to becoming Catholic and understanding their identity as both Americans and Christians at the same time? There's a lot there, it seems to me.
Yeah. So what he one of the issues for him was the hypocrisy that he saw and experienced. So, for example, on his Catholic baptismal certificate, Catholic baptismal certificate, it says Augustus John Tolton, property of Stephen Elliott. Now, that was the first thing. And then when he was going through with Father McGurr and other priests were helping him with his formation to prepare for seminary, he studied philosophy. And he was studying St. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic theologians and philosophers. And he said, well, wait a minute, the things that these guys are teaching, why isn't this being lived out? About owning slaves and the abuse and the inhumane treatment of other human beings made in the image and likeness of God. He said, well, what's going on here? He saw the inherent contradiction. He was very upset about it. And so he made it a point when he became a pastor in Quincy to open his church to everyone, Black, white, Hispanic, Native American. Everyone was welcome in his church because he really wanted to live that gospel in this fullness. And he saw the contradiction. Wait a minute, why is the church following the laws, these unjust laws, Jim Crow and other things in the postbellum era? And why are they not following the gospel? Why are we not following the teachings of Jesus Christ? Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? And so he saw the contradiction. And so he made it his mission and his work when he ended up going to Chicago to really help Black Catholics understand the importance of their place in the church. Because, after everything that he experienced and been through, why did he stay? Why did he stay in the church? He stayed because he recognized that it's all the people in the church are all sinners in need of God's mercy. But he focused on the teaching, not the people, right? That what the church taught is true, good, and beautiful, despite the people in the church who always don't live up to the gospel standards set by Jesus Christ. So that's the thing. And he wanted to help other Black Catholics understand that don't worry about the people. Let's focus on the teaching. And that was a very important part of his mission.
Yeah, you sum that up in this great another great quote from your book. You say, sorry, this is Tolton himself. You quote him. I think this is going to be really wonderful for people to hear. Tolton taught, you write, the Catholic Church deplores a double slavery, that of the mind and that of the body. She endeavors to free us of both. She is the church for our people, he said.
Yes.
What a profound thing that I think really cuts right across, not only stands in opposition to, of course, the evil institution of slavery, but also, even the sorts of things we were talking about before with Martin Luther King, the sort of like ideological mind viruses or like whatever it may be. The church speaks into all of that stuff for all of us, doesn't it?
Yeah, he made those comments during a speech at the very first Black Catholic National Congress in Baltimore, Maryland. That was, in fact, they're still having them now. The Black Catholic Congresses are still happening now every 5 years. But back then, Daniel Rudd was the Black Catholic who founded the Black Catholic Eucharistic Congress, and Father Tolton spoke. In fact, it's one of the very few things we have in writing that's captured what he said, because we don't really have many homilies or some newspaper articles and things like that, but speeches and things that he made. There's hardly anything like that at all. So it was so important that they captured his words there. And his words are very, very important. The double slavery, that of the mind and of the body. Obviously the slavery of the body, everybody would understand that. But the slavery of the mind, this kind of slave mentality, that we have to follow, not the culture, but we have to follow Christ, right? We're in the world, but not of the world. And so we can't allow this culture to enslave us mentally. We have to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, the Catholic faith, which actually frees us. And that's the contradiction, right? Jesus had to die in order to give us life. Wait a minute. So when you look at the cross, that's not a sign of hopelessness and despair. That's a sign of hope. That's a sign of salvation. That's a sign of joy, because Christ conquered the very worst effect of sin, which is death. And mavet in Hebrew means to cut yourself off from God's life. And Jesus endured that so that we can have life. And Father Tolton understood that. He said, let's focus on that rather than, and by focusing on that, people can, again, as Jesus said, we see the good things that we do and give glory to God. And, it may have seemed overly optimistic at the time, but that's exactly the way that he proceeded. And as you alluded to, I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. picked up on that same kind of theme and carried it forward in his own way during the civil rights movement.
Before moving off of Father Tolton, I'm just curious, for you being a deacon and Father Tolton being a priest, you spoke of hope a moment ago. What do you see signs of hope that Black individuals, families, communities in the United States are maybe kind of being drawn to the truth claims of the Catholic Church? Maybe somebody like Father Tolton praying for them from heaven, or you out there speaking, or whatever it may be?
Yeah, so a couple of things. There are still quite a few Black Catholics in the church who are reeling from the sting of the racism they experienced within the church herself. So, for example, my little parish, Immaculate Heart in Portland, Oregon, was traditionally a German and an Irish parish. So even on our high altar today, we have a huge statue of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, because that's the namesake for our parish, Immaculate Heart. But then on either side of the Blessed Mother are much smaller statues of Saint Bonaventure and Saint Patrick, right? For the German and Irish patronage of the parish. And so during that time, a lot of Black Catholics came up from the South, predominantly from Louisiana, but also from Mississippi and Texas, and came to Portland to work in the shipyards during World War II. Well, the Catholics, our parish is the closest one to the shipyards. And so they would come to Mass. And when they came to attend Mass as Catholics, they'd have to sit in the back of the church or sit in the choir loft. So the church was implementing kind of Jim Crow kinds of things within the church. But the church had no mandate to do that. They're supposed to welcome everyone with open arms, because why? What unites us is our faith in Jesus Christ, right? So again, so the church experienced those, or even women who want to become nuns. There were religious orders who said, well, you can't become a nun with us because we don't accept Black women as nuns, wow, So there's still a lot of people stinging from that, in our church today. But there are also wonderful, incredible signs of hope when people get to know Father Tolton and the legacy that he leaves in the church, and his cause for sainthood is moving forward, as well as the other Black American saints or men and women who are on the road to sainthood at different stages. That's definitely a sure sign of hope. When people say to me all the time, well, all this, you belong to the white church. Well, hold on a second. I make my living traveling last year, 250,000 miles a year all over the world. I've been to 32 countries, and I literally get invitations to speak literally every single day of the year. And so where is this racism they're talking about? Because if that were true, no one would have me come speak. And quite frankly, most of the people I speak to are not people of color. Right. And then, I mean, I spoke at a parish last year during Advent where 800 to 1,000 people a night showed up. Again, not necessarily to see me, but they want to hear the beauty and truth, but articulated through a Black Catholic. So you hear all this stuff about, oh, the church is racist, the church is racist. Yes, there probably are some prejudices and some racist. Again, the church herself, though, is not racist. It can't be. The church is the spotless bride of Christ. But there are people in the church who may be racist or have some other kind of prejudices. And so so that, to me, that's white noise, right? I just ignore that and just focus on the mission that God has called me to. And other speakers like Deacon Larry Oney, out of New Orleans, speaks all over the world. There's a wonderful, wonderful deacon as well, Deacon Gerard Marie Anthony, out of Gainesville, Virginia. Phenomenal work that he's doing, as well as some others like Paul J. Kim, who's an Asian Catholic, who's one of the most popular speakers out there, particularly with youth and young adults. And Hector Molina, Hispanic, Puerto Rican, who's phenomenal. I mean, he's truly gifted. He's one of the few people that I say, oh, I can't make it, call this guy. I mean, so there's definitely signs and hope up there, but we have to focus on the hope and not focus on the false, right? And I think that's the key.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of I think it's attributed to Chesterton, the whole "Here comes everybody" line, or something. I think he was fond of that anyway. That's the ideal of being Catholic anyway. As you said, that hasn't always been the experience that everyone has, but I think at our best that does come through, and I'm delighted when it does.
And we have to be careful not to have a victim mentality. Right now, that's not to belittle any of the experiences that people may have gone through. Okay, but at some point you have to say, okay, I'm not going to be thinking like a victim anymore. Like when I get called to go to a parish, if people don't want me there, it's not because I'm Black. They usually say, oh, he's too conservative, whatever that means. Yeah. I hate those terms, liberal and conservative.
Sure.
I'm Catholic, period. They just don't like what I have to say. So they don't invite. It's not because I'm Black. They just don't like what I have to say.
Right.
So we have to get away from this victim mentality. If it exists, we want to get away from that and focus on what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. focused on in his vision for a world of racial equality and equity. And what Father Augustus Tolton focused on as well. And that's why these books that I wrote, the book on Father Tolton and Building Civilization of Love, will help us get to that point. So I'm looking at the issue of race through the lens, look at racial justice through the lens of our faith, right? Which is something that these other ideologies of today don't do at all.
It sounds like, if I may paraphrase Dr. King, it sounds as if what you were saying before is if you go speak somewhere and they don't like you, they're not judging you according to your race, but according to the content of your, maybe not character, but content of your presentation, right?
Exactly. I mean, I've had people walk out on homilies. I've had people complain to the pastor or even to the bishop about, he said that. And that's why I write down my homilies, right? I mean, I don't read them like you're reading a book, but sure. I have my notes and I try to articulate it in a way that's vibrant and that's alive, the Holy Spirit working. But that's why I write my homilies out, and that's why I have notes when I talk, and that's why I record things. Because sometimes when people hear things, they're hearing it is being filtered through the lens of their sin, right? And they're so comfortable in their sin that when you speak truth, and their conscience, right, is wants to move back toward God. It's like, oh, and that's disturbing for them, because it's disturbing their quote unquote peace, not the peace of God that's beyond all understanding, the peace in settling for wallowing in their sin, like the prodigal son in the pig pen, and so when you have that, when I speak the truth, or anyone speaks the truth in love, Ephesians 4:15, and that love starts to move that conscience back toward God, that's very unnerving. And so then someone will say, you said this, when actually I didn't say that, because they're hearing it differently.
Yeah.
So that's something that that we want to avoid. Just listen with the ear of your heart. Saint Benedict says that in the first line of the rule of Saint Benedict for monks. Listen, my son, to the master's precepts, and incline the ear of your heart. And I think that's what Dr. King and Father Augustus, Father Augustus Tolton tried to help people do, to listen with their hearts.
It occurred to me as you were talking about how occasionally someone might take issue with something that you say, that one of your nicknames or your monikers is the Dynamic Deacon. And that's it. The dynamism, right? The dynamite, even, to have that power when you speak it's important, and there's not enough of it in the world, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I didn't come up with that, by the way.
Okay. Okay.
So how that came about was, so when I had discerned that God was calling me to leave my secular job, I was in law enforcement for 23 years, and I was actually a police chief for the last 11 years of my career. And so in 2011, I had a tremendous experience with Christ in Eucharistic adoration, where basically he told me to leave and to speak and to write full time. Now, I have been speaking part time, because my boss at the university I was a police chief on a college campus. So my boss was a Catholic. And so in fact, he was a parishioner in my parish at that time. And so he would allow me to go do EWTN, or go speak at a men's conference, or go do this retreat, like break during fall break or winter break or spring break or Christmas break and summer, when kids aren't in school, so he would allow those things to happen. And so I thought, oh, speaking is my hobby, because I have my real job and I have my hobby. Well, God in 2011 very clearly called me away or challenged me to leave that and to speak and eventually to write on a full-time basis. And I was like, nope, not me. You mean somebody else. And I fought it. I actually fought it. And so when I finally gave in and said, okay, God, this is your will, this is what you want, I met a woman who was a publicist, a Catholic publicist, and she was helping her husband, and her husband had a business, and so she was kind of helping him. And she goes, and one of the times I was with them, she goes, oh, if you ever need some help, just let me know. I'd love to help you out, with some publicity or something like that, or marketing. I said, okay, I'll think about it. Well, when God asked me to leave, I said, oh, I remember, let me give her a call. And so I didn't have really an apostolate at the time. I had a website, and just where people could just download stuff and see where I'm going to be at my next engagement. I was doing it all myself. And so she kind of took that over, and I was calling my apostolate Aurum Cordis, which is Latin for ear of the heart. Again, from the first line of the prologue of St. Benedict. I was a Benedictine in my 20s, and so I love St. Benedict, and so I used part of that for my apostolate. Well, she goes, if you're going to do this on a full-time basis, we need to change that. Because, first of all, Aurum Cordis, nobody can pronounce it. Nobody knows what it means. They can't associate it with you. I said, well, I don't care if they're associated with me. I'm here for Jesus. I ain't here for Deacon Harold. I'm here for Christ. He goes, yeah, I get all that. I get it. But still, if you're going to do this work for Christ, you need to have, identify it better. So she goes, let me think about it, pray about it, and come back with something for you to consider. Okay, great. So then she comes back, several days later with Dynamic Deacon. I'm like, no. I said, that's arrogant. I mean, should I have a big D on my chest with a cape or something like that? Like dynamic. I'm like, no, I didn't like it at all. But, she goes, well, it's catchy. It's kind of like the Dynamic Deacon kind of flows, and it describes your speaking style. Although actually I'm an introvert, which you probably can't tell from this interview, but there was a reason why I was in a monastery. There's a reason why I absolutely love adoration, where I feel mostly like myself when I'm before the Lord before Him in the Blessed Sacrament. There's a reason for that. And so, yeah, the speaking, because I just love being Catholic and I just want to share that faith with passion and conviction. And so I said, you know what? Look, I trust you, so if you think this is the way we should go, let's do it. And it's caught on ever since. But I never call myself that.
Fair
And
enough.
but it's all good. It's all for the Lord. So it's all good.
Well, I like it. And by the way, I think that some of the very best public speakers, of which you are one, are very often introverts. That the dynamism, that power comes from that time of contemplation, the time away, and then it pours forth with that energy.
Nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. That's exactly right. People say, where do you get your energy from? Well, from adoration.
Yeah.
Like after a talk, I just want to crawl back into my room and just be by myself.
Yeah. I feel the same way.
Eucharistic Congress, I spoke at not the main sessions at night where there was the almost 60,000 people. I spoke in one of the major breakout sessions, what they call impact sessions, which was in Lucas Oil Stadium, but there were only about 35,000 people.
Oh my goodness.
During my talk. And so, after that, you come off and I'm just like, people want to take pictures. I was like, I just want to be by myself right now,
Yeah.
So, so it's a wonderful kind of balancing act, where I'm clearly doing what I think God put me on this earth to do. But I have to find that time to recharge so I can continue to do the work that God has asked me to do.
Yeah, and that time away is where you get to read and write. And I want to come back to your wonderful book, Building a Civilization of Love, which you've already mentioned a couple times. So, and we did a whole podcast before just on that one book, and we will definitely direct our listeners and our viewers to go back and check out that conversation that we had. But in that conversation, Deacon Harold, we talked a little bit about one line in your book that really struck me. You said, the church's response to racism has been steadily making progress. And I've pondered that quite a bit since we spoke. And we've already kind of touched on that a little bit in our conversation so far. But, times move quickly and things change all the time. So I'm finding myself wanting to ask you, what are ways in which the church is kind of making progress with regard to kind of its understanding of its response to racism, maybe even since just in the last couple of years?
All right. Well, if we look at where the church was during the time of slavery, it was very much a mixed bag. I mean, I make that very clear in the book. I don't shy away from the fact that there were priests, bishops, religious orders who actively owned and sold slaves. And some of the attitudes that they have, for example, when they misinterpret St. Paul, those slaves, obey your masters, be obedient to your masters. He wasn't talking about chattel slavery. That's why I spend the first part of the book talking about the different form. It's the same word in Hebrew, but you have to understand the context for understanding this. There's 5 different types of slavery that's mentioned in the Bible. And one of the ones they said that the Israelites were absolutely not to participate in was chattel slavery. Because remember, you were once slaves in the land of Egypt. And so you will not enslave anybody. That was very, very clear. So then if that's the case, and Paul brags in Galatians how he was one of the most strict observances of the law, as a Pharisee, right? So he would have known the law and understood that. So what is he talking about then? We have to look at the other types of slavery he was talking about, like the indentured servitude. That's what he was talking about, and I talk about that in the book. So you move from there to where the church, in a sense, advocated for slavery and used the scriptures as a way to defend that decision. Then you move away into the postbellum era, into Jim Crow, and the church was pretty much silent on issues of race until the 1950s. That's when the very first document came out from the Catholic Church. It wasn't called the USCCB, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops at that time, but that's what came up with their first document. Then over since then, there's been a number of documents that have come out from the Bishops' Conference or from individual bishops about the issue of race. Or Bishop Braxton, who's one of probably the foremost prelate. He's a retired bishop from Illinois. He's probably the most outspoken prelate on this issue of race. And you read all those writings, so that it's become more in the consciousness of the church. So again, the church herself, if you look at the teachings, are not racist, but there still are individuals within the church. So you can't say, well, the church is racist. No, there may be people in the church. And that's where we have to make the distinction, because you just can't blanket say the church is racist. But still, there's work to do. What do I mean? I remember going to a parish once, and it was a 2-hour drive from the airport. So they had me rent a car. And so I'm driving, and I realized on the GPS on my phone that they gave me directions to the parish, but not to the rectory. So this is one of those situations where the rectory is in a neighborhood that's not connected to the parish. And so I got to the church, and there I looked at the door of the church. There were posters with my picture on it talking about the mission that I was there to do. And so I said, "Oh, I better find out where the rectory is." And so I got out of the car, I walked to the church, and someone was coming out of the church. I'm like, "Oh, I just asked this person." And so I walked in and I said, "Excuse me." And the person said, "Oh, the St. Vincent de Paul is closed today."
Oh, man.
Now, I looked at them and I said, "Well, that's good information, but I'm actually, turn around. That's me on the door there on the poster.
Ooh.
I'm actually looking for the rectory so I can at least meet the priest before I have to preach at the vigil mass tonight."
Oh, my
Oh,
goodness.
Deacon, oh, thank you. I mean, stuff like that, right? Or
Yeah.
the one parish where I'm loading my stuff, my suitcase with my product, books, and well, back then CDs and DVDs, but now I have everything on USB, much more efficient. But I was packing things, putting them in my car, and a cop car pulls up. And I was a cop though, so I was like, I didn't even think anything of it. And so the officer gets out, comes over, and goes, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm doing real well, officer. How are you doing? So great to see you." He goes, "Oh, thank you." He goes, "Do you have ID?" And as soon as he said that, I'm like, "Uh-oh, somebody called this guy." Because I'm not
Whoa.
doing it. What happened was they got a complaint of suspicious activity in the church parking lot.
Oh,
I said,
man.
"Well, I'm doing is I just finished doing a mission. I'm loading my stuff up because I have to drive back to the hotel, then go to the airport in the morning." And so as I'm having this conversation, the pastor who was turning off the lights and locking the doors came over and saw. He goes, "Is something wrong? Is something happened? What's going on?" And I said, "Well, someone called the officer here because they saw suspicious activity, probably me loading my bags. They thought I was stealing from the church." Oh my goodness. Father was so angry and he
Yeah.
was embarrassed, And so, so the officer said, "Okay, everything's cool." He left. No big deal. And so I went back, but I heard that father was very upset and let the parish know how upset he was about this. So there's still things like that are happening in the church today. But again, you don't leave Jesus because of Judas.
Yeah.
I mean, again, go back to focus on what Father Tolton said. You focus on the teaching, not the people, even though the people are not following the example and not being exemplars of what they're supposed to be professing.
Yeah.
And so that's what we have to focus on.
I think that's really fascinating, Deacon Harold, here, and just as we wrap up. I mean, because I think the stories that you just shared, it seems to me, are precisely the kinds of things you would hear somebody point to and say, now that's evidence that our struggle is against systemic racism, right? Rather than hey, let's...
No.
Yeah.
It would be systemic racism if the church promoted that activity.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
That's the key.
Yeah.
When you talk about system, you talk about within system. For example, here's a great example. Back in the day, there was something known as redlining. Okay? So if you are a homeowner or a business owner of color, Black, Hispanic, Native American, whatever, and you wanted a loan from a bank back in the day, the banks would draw a red line around particular neighborhoods that they said, "We will not lend to these neighborhoods because they're Black or they're Hispanic," right? That is a practice called redlining. It was something that was common among banks and financial institutions back in the Jim Crow era. Well, of course, now no bank has any system like that at all. So it's not within the system anymore. There's no systemic redlining in the banking system. However, You may have a loan officer in that bank who says, you know what? I think that people of color are a bad risk for loans. Therefore, I will not give any loans to any people of color. Now, they're not following what the bank says. They're not following the tenets and the procedures and the policies of the bank. They're doing this as an individual. So you can't blame the system for an individual. That's why I said before, we have to start with people and changing people, minds, and hearts in order to facilitate a change, a systematic change. But we have to start with people and changing hearts.
A powerful, timely message. We are just scratching the surface, but we are unfortunately out of time. I want to recommend to our listeners and viewers once again that they run, not walk, to get themselves a copy of Building a Civilization of Love, published by Ignatius Press, and also your book on Father Augustus Tolton, the two books that we've discussed today, among your other titles. But really wonderful stuff in those books, and really wonderful stuff in this conversation. Deacon Harold, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
You are most welcome. I appreciate you very much having me. I love my relationship with Ignatius Press, and I encourage everyone to go through their catalog and buy the books and learn and enrich your mind so you can be drawn closer to Christ.
Thank you very much.